Welcome to Asia Unlocked, where we cover current events and emerging trends in Asia. Today I'm joined by Dr. Sheila Smith, who will help us understand the implications of Japan's recent snap election. Dr. Smith is a senior fellow for Asia Pacific Studies at the Council for Foreign Relations. She is also a visiting professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Dr. Smith, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Eric.
Let's start by talking about the recent snap election. What prompted Takaichi to call for the election, and how closely does the outcome mirror what people were expecting?
Well, I think the outcome is a surprise to just about everybody. I would hazard a guess it may even have been a surprise to Prime Minister Takaichi. But what caused her to call the snap election is she wanted, and she publicly called for, an election as a mandate on her policy direction for Japan. She came into office, as you're aware, in October last year, so she hasn't been in office very long. Nonetheless, she laid out a pretty extensive program of economic security, and broad diplomacy. So I think she's made her policy positions very, very clear, even before coming into office. But she really wanted the imprimatur of a mandate for that direction for her administration to take. The LDP, as you know, suffered a fairly extensive setback in 2024 in their lower house election, losing 58 seats. So she really also wanted to put her party back in a much stronger position in the lower house. She was ruling a cabinet from a minority position. Her longstanding partner, the Komeito, had left the coalition, and she formed a new coalition with Ishin no Kai, or the Japan Innovation Party. So the other goal, I believe, for this election was to really put her government back in a far stronger position in the lower house, and that would facilitate legislating policy change, the changes that she outlined.
That makes sense. And I think that's a perfect segue to my next set of questions, especially given that you talked about how the LDP suffered during the previous election. There have also been a lot of statistics and analysis done that show that the LDP is not in a great position in terms of public support. But despite the LDP's current position, Takaichi's approval rates are well above the LDP's approval rates. So I was wondering if you could talk to us about the variables or the factors that led to or allowed for Takaichi's landslide victory, as some have put it.
So that's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I can give you a definitive answer. I think all of us are waiting to parse out the demographic details of the election and other pieces of the puzzle. But let me talk a little bit about some of the factors. One is, and this is a structural challenge in Japanese electoral politics, and that is the weakness of the opposition. So the LDP, even when they're back on they've been pushed back by the voters on their back heels like they were in 2024. They had to come back with a promise that they'd be able to work with other parties. But there was no party on the outside that could really challenge the LDP in terms of taking over as ruling party, of claiming a majority. You have one moment in Japanese politics in 2009 where the Democratic Party of Japan managed to do that with a huge excitement of the voters. But I think today you just don't have that one big party that would, really give the LDP a run for its money. So you had a lot of smaller parties. You had a centrist left party, the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, that was looking weak. And increasingly, when she called the snap election, they turned to the Komeito, the old coalition partner of the LDP, to form a new alliance, the Center Reform Alliance. And the interesting thing about the outcome of that election, it was demonstrable that the Japanese voters were not gravitating towards that definition of the party that they thought was gonna lead Japan going forward. So they lost a considerable amount of seats, somewhere from about 167 to about 49 seats. And Komeito managed to stay in place largely because they used their proportional seats as a way of, continuing to be represented in the lower house. But the sort of center-left coalition that they formed to try to challenge Takaichi and her party was a massive defeat. Again, just bringing home to Japanese voters that structural weakness of opposition parties to really claim the mantle of trying to rule Japan. So you've got a lot of parties now. You've got a lot of 11 parties ran in that election, by the way. Some of them teeny tiny. Some of them don't exist in the diet anymore as a result. But you've got some medium-size or smaller-size parties that are interesting to watch, and we can talk about those if you want. They will be looking to present the cabinet or Takaichi with new policy ideas, cooperation if they agree, but no cooperation if they don't. Not sure it matters given the numbers that the ruling coalition managed to achieve, but nonetheless, we should be paying attention to them as students of Japanese politics. These are interesting new parties with some unusual new party positions.
I think you raised a couple of really interesting points. I think my first follow-up question on that is, what do you think about the ability of these opposition parties to survive? You've mentioned before that there have been previous opposition parties that simply weren't able to keep up. And I'm wondering, given the results of the recent snap election, given the majority that the LDP enjoys now, what are minority leaders thinking or opposition leaders thinking? What are the challenges that they need to overcome, and what steps do you think they might take in order to improve their political standing?
So one point was, again, the LDP was ruling from a minority coming into this election. So that meant that we would expect the LDP to reach out to these smaller parties. The Democratic People's Party, the DPP, led by Mr. Tamaki, was one that a lot of people thought would be a nice partner on some policy issues. His party is mostly focused on economic issues, mostly focused on, we can talk more about the details of it, but helping Japanese who are struggling with the cost of living, trying to make social supports to families and households that are economically challenged better, right? So he's got a lot of issues on the social side, social welfare side of economic policymaking. There's a new party that really caught people's attention in last year's upper house election, the Sanseito, and they did that by campaigning on the idea of Japanese first, not Japan first, but Japanese first. And their complaint was largely about the behavior of non Japanese in Japanese society, be they tourists or be they permanent residents. So, this is the party that got a lot of people and a lot of writing in the foreign press about this populist right new party. Mirai no To is one I was surprised. I think they came out with 9 seats, but they didn't have any before. Mirai means future in Japan. It's led by a very young leader, and they are very focused on tech, innovation, social, all kinds of issues surrounding the kind of next generation agenda of younger Japanese. So you've gotten these parties coming to the fore. They all have slightly different niches in terms of their policy focus, but they offer, I think, a range of sort of slightly right to left, right identities, but they really are trying to bring new solutions to the fore in terms of the policies that Japan needs to consider.
One of the most interesting things you just mentioned was this concept of Japanese first, which we'll put a pin in for now, but I'll definitely come back to that when we talk about another one of the factors. So you've talked about the challenges that the opposition parties face, but some analysts have also talked about how Takaichi as a leader or as an individual has a certain charm that lends itself to her support rates. What's your take on that argument or that viewpoint?
Hard to win a victory in a democracy on charm. But, 2 things about Takaichi, I think, and you mentioned one earlier in your remarks, that we have to really take seriously. One is, the LDP itself was quite divided between more centrist liberal and a little bit more hawkish slash, um, nationalist kind of orientation. She would be on that latter side of the internal divide in the LDP. But you saw this going back to Ishiba Shigeru's election as leader. She was not that far behind him in that contest several years ago. And the party really did sort of seem to fracture into 2 camps. And there was a little bit of tension in the party. She has obviously, with this win and her risk taking on this election, and she has put the party back in a position it has never held before, which is 2/3 majority for the LDP alone in that lower house. So this is a first, and this is really gonna solidify her position within the party. So that's one thing I think that's really important to understand about her, is her internal position is now pretty solidly, laid. The foundation has been solidly laid. I think what's been interesting to watch her as prime minister since October is Lots of people like to say she was the right wing, she was the nationalist, she was, and to be sure, she is a social conservative. So when it comes to issues of the family, of community, she tends to be very focused on traditional Japanese values. For example, she doesn't believe that women should carry their maiden name into a marriage. She wants the family unit to have one name, not two. Um, she also feels very strongly on this issue of the disruptions to community of foreigners who don't behave according to Japanese norms and practices. So she has a position on that. It's more of a social cultural position. And she very quickly took up that issue when she became prime minister. But I think, what I take from her is, and there's a lot of chitter chatter in social media in Japan about her. But I think what's been striking to watch in terms of her political style is she's a very straight talker. And you saw that, in the controversy over her mention of what Japan might do if Beijing used force against Taiwan in the Diet, right? She tried to, manage it as best she could, but then she just basically said what was policy. And I think that she has that kind of style, and I think there's a lot of appetite for that in Japan. There's some complex social, political, economic problems, to be solved, and her direct approach and fairly policy savvy approach. She doesn't butter things up in vague language. She doesn't use political sloganing too much. She just goes straight at the issue that she gets asked about. And I think that's very refreshing for a Japanese political leader to be that direct.
On a side note, I appreciate your clarification of the situation that happened with regard to Takaichi's comments on Taiwan. While I was doing research to get ready for this episode, I saw a lot of people cite what happened in the Diet during that time, and I would make the argument that a lot of people got it wrong in terms of characterizing what it was that Takaichi actually said. But a follow up question to some of the things you just mentioned. You talked about how her direct and policy savvy approach is refreshing. And it could be a source of one of the many sources of increased support for Takaichi. But I'm wondering if you can talk to us about some of the policy stances Takaichi has taken that may not reflect the public's sentiments or interests. For example, a Stanford Japan Barometer survey shows that same sex marriage is gaining increasing support in Japan, but it's well known that Takaichi doesn't support its legalization. Why is she able to see strong approval rates despite possible tensions or possible disapproval among the public? Is it a question of how voters prioritize issues, or is there something else that we should be aware of?
So it's hard in just one election to be able to um, really parse out, like, this issue is where she had trouble. It's also very hard to do that because she has a two-thirds majority in the lower house. So, in my initial comment about what the election results say, we focused on what they say about Takaichi, and I added a little bit of, this is, also a problem. The opposition isn't, gaining traction. Um, I think on some of these issues, I mean, I think it would be hard for any of us experts to characterize Japan as fully on board with all of the conservatism or conservative ideas that she herself has espoused. Um, One of the reasons, this was widely accepted as one of the reasons in Japan as well as by outside observers, that the LDP did so badly in 2024 was the political corruption issue, the money and politics issue. And there, Prime Minister Kishida, asked his Secretary General, Mr. Motegi, to do a survey of spending and how people were spending, especially slush funds that were reported by certain people, politicians within the party. They did a very thorough investigation. They found people. I wrote about this on CFR.org if people are interested in the details. But she took a quite controversial position when she was running for the leadership of the party. She said those people have already suffered. The people who violated the law, right, with these slush funds have already suffered. They've suffered at the hands of the voters. They've suffered at the hands of the party because the party didn't endorse them in 2024, right? And those people can now come back. The people who remain have been endorsed by voters, and they can come back into the leadership of the party. That was a very controversial position within the party, but also was widely criticized, right, when she was running for the leadership. So you don't actually have to do the social conservative versus the more liberal progressive wing division within the party to see that she also has some practical ideas about managing the party that don't necessarily resonate well with the public or even inside the party. Now, I thought that was going to be an issue where she would get some pushback, but some of the people who had been punished were brought back by voters in their constituencies. So clearly, voters are voting in this election on a different basis than they were in 2024. On that kind of controversial money in politics scandal, which of course the LDP has always had to defend itself against mistreatment of funds and campaign funds in particular. Another area where on the policy side, again, not the social conservative side, and I'll get to the same-sex marriage issue in just a second, but is on the yen. She has made repeated statements that a cheap yen is actually good for the Japanese economy, and that has ruffled a few feathers, let's say, in the business community. Japanese corporations abroad or the Japanese corporations who rely on exports, there are some sectors, obviously, of the Japanese economy that do well with less expensive exports, right? So there are some industries that would agree with her, but there are obviously some industries that wouldn't, right? And especially today in the era of tariffs, this position has made people a little jittery, right, about her. The other place where I think you're going to see controversy rather, not so much on the issue of enhancing Japanese defenses. She, after all, was the architect of the 2% of GDP goal that Prime Minister Kishida then adopted in December 2022. She was the head of the Policy Research Council for the party, and that was something she had campaigned on, so she included that in the party's platform, and then it became adopted by the Japanese government. She's always been hawkish on defense. And she has made several comments in the campaign and in the past about nuclear sharing with the United States. Again, quite sensitive issue for Japanese. Not quite sure she's going to get full on consensus or approval for that idea going forward. So there's lots of ways in which, there's still divisions within Japan or people have different points of view than her that she's going to have to argue and persuade if she decides to actually move in those policy directions. The same sex marriage cases, I think, are really quite interesting because there have been 6 court cases in the absence of, right? National legislation on same-sex marriage. You've had 6 court cases with varying results in each of these 6 areas. 2 of them were in Tokyo, right? And there's Sapporo, Osaka, and 2 other districts. But you've had different reactions from the judgments that are made in each of these courts regarding the basic premise of equality under the Constitution, which was the charge in the courts, right? So these will be appealed and they will continue down this adjudication process. But, it was the G7 meeting in Hiroshima when Prime Minister Kishida was still in power. Um, and there was a lot of pressure, as you know, from then Ambassador Rahm Emanuel and other G7 country ambassadors in Tokyo for the Liberal Democratic Party to move to pass a law, right? Especially since it was the one G7 country that didn't recognize same-sex marriage, right? And that was very controversial. A lot of conservatives in the LDP were very disgruntled by what they thought is intervention in Japanese domestic politics on that issue. Kishida in the end did pass legislation, but it was very watered down from a recognition of same-sex marriage. But I think it hit a bad note, right? This external gaiatsu, as they say in Japanese, this G7 ambassadorial sort of campaign to push the Kishida government was the way it was portrayed in the press. Ambassador Emmanuel got huge pushback on social media on his account, right? So you still have a country that is not yet clear on how it wants to go forward nationally on this issue of same-sex marriage, and yet you have quite a bit of local government recognition of the civil rights of residents to receive the same kind of benefit and privileges, right, that every government gives to every citizen. So you see local activism, you see legal advocacy, and then you see this sort of watered down version of national legislation. I don't know that she's going to make this a big issue in her leadership of the party. I don't know that it's going to come back to be re-legislated or reconsidered in the Diet. Given the two-thirds majority, I think it would be hard to open this up again if the ruling party didn't want to open it up again, right? The LDP didn't want to reopen the issue. So I think, again, across the board, there's lots of issues where her personal priorities may not resound well with all Japanese. And I think we should be very, very hesitant to point Japan, to portray all Japanese as supportive of the ideas of Prime Minister Takaichi. But in terms of who and which party is leading the government, I think the outcome of Sunday's election was quite definitive.
I want to transition to another issue before we talk about the policy and talk about what we should look forward to given the LDP supermajority. So, some have argued that recent events involving China helped Takaichi in the polls. One Japanese voter said she supported Takaichi's tough on China approach and was quoted as saying, Japan should maintain a firm stance without making any compromises. To what extent do you think rising Sino Japanese tensions drove increased support for Takaichi or influenced the outcome of the election?
Again, hard to parse this in a very exact way, but let me offer a couple of comments. One is she is quite hawkish on defense, and by hawkish, I mean she wants a strong defense. I mentioned 2% of GDP. She is open to, she obviously supported the acquisition of counter strike capability, which is long range conventional strike capability for Japan. She has also advocated the placement of intermediate range missiles by American forces on Japanese soil. So she is quite, counter the typical way we think of Japanese as being constrained or hesitant, right, about moving forward, both with the capabilities of Japan's own self-defense force or with allowing the United States to deploy weaponry or forces on Japanese soil. We have 50,000 men and women, American men and women in uniform in Japan, so we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that relationship for Japan's own defenses and deterrence in the region. So she's quite bold on that, no hesitation whatsoever. She's quite firm. I think I am seeing, and again wrote about this for CFR.org for this election, is what's interesting today is it used to be you'd have a whole host of political parties, maybe not the LDP, but other parties who had a position on Article 9 and on the idea that, no compromise, right? Japan should have a territorial defense. It should have limited capabilities. It should not engage in operations with the United States or other military partners. That is gone. So, and I went through all of the parties that ran, and again, some more important than others. There was nary a mention of Article 9 in their manifestos. Very unusual for that if you've been following post-war Japanese domestic politics and the security debate. So it's gone from basically opposition parties being the defenders of Article 9 or portraying themselves that way. Even Komeito, which was in coalition with the LDP for 26 years, saw itself as the hadome in Japanese, means a brake, like a brake, a car brake, a brake on the acceleration of defense efforts by the LDP. So even within the ruling coalition, you had a party that saw itself, its job was to make sure Japan was measured in its defense policy. Though that's gone. And it's gone, and it's interesting that it's gone. And I think what you can look at is there's opinion polling over time done by Yomiuri Shimbun. I think it has the most consistent overtime polling on defense issues. But the Cabinet Secretariat also conducts polling, different questions asked, of course. But what you see in the trend lines over time, and this is true of Asahi and Mainichi, who are more intermittent in their polling, but more kind of on the more progressive side of the political spectrum, is you see Japanese responses to questions about defense revealing that there's growing concern, not about what their government is going to do that would violate Article 9, but whether or not the neighborhood they live in, if Japan is really fully prepared to defend itself. And so, again, North Korean ambitions, nuclear ambitions, and their missile program, China's growing maritime and air presence in and around Japanese territory. There's a whole host of worries now about whether or not Japan is fully prepared should there be a crisis. You see that also in the Taiwan response, the response to the prime minister's Taiwan comments, I think, as well. So it's hard to know how much of people's voting behavior was driven by defense, but I would say the absence of a strong break on the LDP's defense, in particular hers, right? Ideas, I think that's something new, and that's something we should all be paying attention to. It doesn't mean Japan is helter skelter going to be, doing all kinds of crazy things, but the public is more worried about whether the country can defend itself, I believe, than it is about questions about, violating the spirit of Article 9. And that means a new chapter in Japanese politics for security policymaking.
On a related note, going back to and this ties back to what we discussed regarding Japanese first. I want to ask you about the question of nationalism. Some people have made the argument that Takaichi's landslide victory is an indicator that nationalistic fervor or nationalistic sentiment is on the rise in Japan. What's your assessment? But also, what do you think people are referring to when they say nationalism?
Oh, what a great question. Thank you. I'm laughing because I teach a course on Asia's nationalisms in the fall. And Derek was in that course, and we had long conversations about what do we mean by the word nationalism. So he's giving me an exam backwards, reverse exam for the professor. Let me talk a little bit about Sanseito and the foreigner issue. And I think we have to give credit is a bad word here, but Sanseito has really claimed this foreigner issue, like the behavior of foreigners in Japan, the welcome mat being placed for foreigners in Japan to come and stay for long-term stay, migrant laborers and others, et cetera, right? It kind of highlights a kind of xenophobic populism, and so that's where we come with this kind of nationalist label on that issue. It's important to recognize is that there are just as many civil society groups, local groups, politicians who are advocating for a greater welcome and a greater program for social inclusion for migrant workers and other non-Japanese residents in Japan. So I think you've got a little tension here in Japanese society. There's discomfort with the idea that immigrants could be, taking over. That's the kind of immigration perception you see in Western Europe. You see it here in the United States. You know, it is an issue that sort of invites that kind of national identity debate is the way I would put it. It is a third rail for conservatives because they saw it's like Prime Minister Takaichi. She also brought this issue up last fall when she was running for the presidency of the party and sort of co-opted Sanseito on this issue. So when she became prime minister, she appointed Minister Onoda with this task of thinking how foreigners could be better educated on the norms and rules of Japanese society and how the over tourism issue in particular could be managed better by Japan. So the commission that was led by Minister Onoda came up with some policy recommendations, none of which are, get rid of the immigrants. They're all about how do we charge more for visas? How do we teach Japanese to foreign residents? So they're quite mild in the kind of broader context of an immigration debate in the other advanced industrial countries. So that being said, however, Sanseito is deliberately trying to tap into a more populist sentiment, and this issue of non-Japanese and Japanese society has hit a nerve. And so they have been very successful on that. Last word I'll say about Sanseito is if you look at all the single member districts, and these are districts where the winner is the first past the post, right? Taking, the majority of votes in a constituency. It's like if you're an American citizen, that's how we run our legislative elections, right? Sanseito has anywhere between 10 and 20,000 votes in any given constituency in Japan. That is a pretty spectacular accomplishment for a new political party running in highly contested very difficult to campaign national elections for single member districts. So I think if you're looking at the Sanseito from the position of the LDP, they are more comfortable in the wake of that Sunday election today than they were going in, because they worried that the Sanseito was peeling off sort of ultra conservative or more social conservative, right? National identity votes that the Sanseito is claiming. So I think it's really important to understand that that issue continues to be on the conservative side of Japanese politics, will continue to be contested. How far? What kind of policies? And we should pay attention to this going forward, because there will be laws and new legislation put in front of the Diet going forward. Um, Hopefully that helps with the Sanseito question. On a broader, um, your broader question about nationalism within the LDP, and we've seen this prominently in leadership of Abe Shinzo, right now Takaichi. Um, there are revisionist nationalist positions in the LDP. There always have been. So even inside that big party, you've got differences. Not everybody who's an LDP member believes the same things that Mr. Abe or Prime Minister Takaichi believe. One of the things I've thought has been interesting since she came to power is the way in which she's managed the relationship with South Korea. Now, in her personal capacity, before she became leader of the party, she often took quite controversial positions, for example, on the so called comfort women issue, and positions that really helped brandish her as being on the right of the spectrum within the LDP. But she has managed to develop a relationship with President Lee, and I think, again, President Lee of South Korea gets half the credit, obviously, for this. But the Japan ROK relationship today is on a much, much better footing than many people thought it might be, given her positions on some of the the questions of historical memory. So again, not a holistic answer to your nationalism question, but you can see she's trying to work on pieces of her reputation and her past statements and act in a way that she sees as being more strategic for Japan. And so I don't see her, you know, her national identity sort of positioning that we've become used to seeing her amplify. I think she has pulled back, just as Prime Minister Abe did. She's pulled back on the more controversial ones when it comes to leading the country.
That makes sense, and I think that was a great reflection on the snap election. But now I'd like to take a forward-looking approach to understanding the policy implications of Takaichi's victory. So before we discuss the policy issues, could you share some context on the Japanese Diet for our listeners? Takaichi's victory has often been described as a landslide victory, and people often refer to the LDP's supermajority in the lower house. But what does that mean, and why does that matter for Takaichi's policy goals?
Very briefly, for those listeners who may not be familiar with parliamentary dynamics, um, this is very similar to the UK, to Germany, to Israel, right? Parliamentary systems don't have presidents elected separately from the legislative branch. So if your party has a majority, then you get to pick the prime minister. You get to vote, and then you have the number of hands to raise to select the leader of the country. That's the difference between running from a minority and running from a majority. If you are in the minority, you have to get other parties to agree that your pick for prime minister is also going to be their pick. And that's where we were when Takaichi was elected last October, and where we were prior to that in 2024 after the LDP's loss in the lower house election there. Those were deals that were made to make sure that the LDP candidate would be the prime minister. Today, two-thirds majority, way past the polls, right, on this. 316 seats, I think, was the tally from Sunday's election. 310 is two-thirds of the 465 seats in the lower house. And in two-thirds, if you have a two-thirds majority, there's all kinds of benefits that accrue. First, you get to pick all the committee chairmen. Second, you get to run the table on the timeline and what legislation comes up when and where, and if at all. But the most important one of that supermajority is you have enough votes to override the upper house. The legislation first goes to the lower house. If you have 316 votes, you can pass any legislation you want, pretty much, right? Then it goes to the upper house. The upper house has a certain time frame to deliberate and decide a yes or a no. The upper house, by the way, is still not a majority, right, for the LDP. And so it can say the upper house can reject the legislation and kick it back to the LDP, but with a two-thirds majority, I'm sorry, the LDP, the lower house, but with a two-thirds majority, you can override it, the upper house um, veto. So it is a powerful position in a parliamentary system to have two-thirds majority in the lower house. It is a powerful mechanism if you are prime minister and want to pass new policy legislation. It virtually gives you not carte blanche because nothing gives you carte blanche, right? It gives you a fairly free hand, however, in making sure if you line the timing up right, you can override an upper house veto on any piece of legislation. Just a footnote for history here, Eric, if people were interested in security policy, um, Prime Minister Abe's cabinet reinterpreted Article 9 to allow for the right of collective self-defense. And then in 2015, 2014 prepared legislation for the Diet that was then voted on in 2015. That new security legislation that was passed in 2015 was because the LDP and Komeito, the coalition, had a supermajority in the lower house. So they managed to pass that legislation with exactly the dynamics that you're going to see Prime Minister Takaichi take advantage of here. The difference, she doesn't need Ishin no Kai because her party can do it all by themselves. So I think she'll want to have Ishin no Kai come along for the ride. But she's even in a stronger position than Abe was in 2015.
Uh, That's useful context. And with that context, I want to wrap up by talking about one of the largest issue areas for Takaichi, and that's her ability to deliver on economic policy. So, Takaichi promised to reduce the burden of taxes while increasing government spending in areas like defense. But some have argued that the promise lacks a clear funding mechanism. What's your assessment, and how do you think Takaichi might go about resolving this tension?
I think, again, we're all going to have to watch and see. You could raise taxes if your economy is growing. So she is doing in broad brushstrokes, the politics of stimulus for the economy, especially her investment in innovation, high tech, and wants to identify super sectors where the Japanese can really thrive. Um, and then she's looking at taxes that can be, if not cut, at least reduced. And she's very much focused on the household economy. So as you might guess, the cost of living was very much a part of Japanese, what Japanese voters were worried about in the last several elections. We think of it as affordability. Um, that is also an issue in Japan. Inflation is not as high as here, but nonetheless, there is a call for greater assistance for households, for education, for families with children, for rural small and medium-sized businesses. So there's a lot of sectors of the Japanese economy that are suffering, right? So she's already reduced the gas tax. She promised in the election to reduce consumption tax on food and other daily necessities. And every political party actually in this election had a position on that consumption tax. So she's looking, and she's also wanting to create a fund that would be then distributed to local governments that they can then parse out to small and medium-sized businesses that need assistance, need help. So she's looking to ways that the government can support, right, different parts of the Japanese economy or Japanese society that are suffering. I think what's gonna be hard is, she's got a lot of policies, and it's not just in the economic realm, not in the growth sector kind of support subsidies that she's articulated, but to the defense, right? She's got a lot of programs that she wants to pursue. And so there'll be trade-offs, I think, in the end between where does the government spend its money and in what order. As you know, she accelerated the achievement of 2% of GDP of defense spending for this fiscal year. By the end of this year, you'll see a next 5-year plan, which I am thinking she's gonna go to 3% of GDP, or roughly. that's going to mean tax dollars. I mean, where are those taxes going to come from? Sorry, they're not dollars, they're yen. Tax yen. So she'll have trade-offs, and as she tries to govern to bring a lot of these ideas into reality, right, into fruition, there will be tugging and pulling, and there will be trade-offs about how much she has to spare in terms of government coffers. I do feel that this is going to be one of her biggest challenges is going to be the economy, and the growth stimulus in particular is going to be one segment of Japan's policy challenges, not just this year but in years to come. Right? You've got an aging society. You've got volatility, to put it mildly, in the global economy. You've got resource challenges. Japan is highly dependent on oil and gas from abroad. So there's a lot here that any prime minister would have trouble dealing with. But I think she's headed maybe not exactly down the path of Abenomics, but she's going to be trying to address structural issues while at the same time stimulating the economy, while at the same time giving voters slash consumers some tax relief. And so we'll have to watch and see.
I agree. It sounds like we'll have to watch and see how Takaichi navigates the challenge of trade offs while also stimulating growth for the Japanese economy. Thank you again for joining us, Dr. Smith.
My pleasure.
Thank you for tuning into this episode. We hope you join us in tracking emerging events across the Asia Pacific and join us for our next episode of Asia Unlocked.